Hello, everyone. I hope that you're all doing well. This video is potentially the first in a series of videos about academic training. As I said in a previous video, I have been thinking about making a series of videos about such topics. And since I consider reading to be the backbone, the foundation of scholarly work, academic work, I thought maybe I can begin with talking about reading academic articles. And these are 10 ideas. Let's begin by asking who this is for. I think primarily early career PhD students, master's students, and even ambitious undergraduate students. And also people who are considering getting into an academic career. But these are not advice, they are non-advice. They are ideas for you to consider, maybe to experiment with for a couple of weeks, a few months, and maybe even reject. There's something potentially useful in considering an idea and then consciously rejecting. And in that conscious rejection of an idea that I offer you here, something useful can come out of that. Future videos in this series about related topics could be about having a journal club, participating in a journal club, or organizing a journal club. I could also do a video about writing as a habit, and writing as a process that results in productivity and building CV, and student-advisor relationship, some ideas about that, and anything that you might suggest. I'm open to your suggestion. As long as I have something to say, I'll be happy to discuss with you. So this is a few things about my background. I'm not including this part to establish myself as an authority and say, this is why you should listen to me and you should trust everything I tell you. No, I just want to show you my background. And my background has limits, and I have my own biases. This is my history of having tried a few things, having achieved a few things, completed some things. And that's a very short summary of that history. I finished my bachelor's degree in psychology at Trent University in Canada. And I completed my PhD at the University of Toronto 5 years later. My PhD thesis was about the relationship between memory and attention. So attentional bias, and how our attentional bias is partly a product of our history, our history of learning. In addition to that central piece of work, which my thesis, I also, during those 5 years in Toronto, I published articles about other topics, neighboring topics, but they're all in the broad area of cognitive psychology, including embodied perception, embodied vision, the relationship between action and attention, hemispheric specialization, hemispheric bias, again in vision and visual memory, and even a side project about long-term effects of gaming. After that, I did 1 year of postdoctoral fellowship at Leiden University in the Netherlands. And then in 2016, joined the University of Macau as an assistant professor. One turning point, I did jump around from topic to topic, field to field, several times during my doctoral years. But one major turning point was when I wrote and published this short commentary with the title Phenomenology as Critique, Discovery, and Justification. This is it was a critical point for me, because I kind of separated from my original field, from the field that I completed my doctoral training in. And that kind of separation became complete with next year with the publication of Behavior versus Performance, which was a critical paper about experimental psychology, its biases, its limitations that are not often discussed. 2 years later, that became much more elaborate. It became an overarching critique of experimental psychology, cognitive psychology, in my book, Experimental Psychology and Human Agency. The main point here is that I want to tell you that I jumped from area to area, and I started fresh several times. And every time you start fresh, you start reading articles in a new field, a field that you are not familiar with at first. You have to start a process from the beginning, from a student's perspective, again, from the beginning. And that is a useful thing to have experienced, I think, relevant to the ideas I'm discussing now. So the first of the 10 ideas. So early on, with exposure to each field of research, each scholarly field, early on, our reading will be very slow, considerably slow. And later on, we can be faster and more selective. But early on, our reading is quite slow, and you have to be patient with our reading. It takes time to start reading articles in a new field of research that we are not very familiar with. And there's a reason why we are slow, because we are not just getting information and facts, a series of propositions and facts. What we are getting exposed to is a style of reasoning, it's a way of thinking that is tacitly operating in the way in which these articles are presenting information to us. So that how of presentation, the way in which this field of research is getting into a relationship with a part of reality, that style takes time to become habitual, become second nature. So that's, I think, the main reason we should be patient at first. At the same time, we're also learning to care about a certain way of questioning. In the beginning, you might even ask your supervisor, your mentor, or your colleagues. You might ask even privately, secretly to yourself and say, why do people care about this topic? Why is my supervisor? Why has he or she devoted 10 years of their lives studying this topic? And am I being indoctrinated into caring about this topic? Is it unnatural in some sense to care about these research questions? These are, I think, valid questions to think about. Again, my main point here in this first idea is that it takes time to get into that style of reasoning and style of caring, which is associated with it. Second idea, every field of research has relatively more foundational articles, and it is very helpful to go and find those foundational articles. One of the signs of the foundational article is that it is frequently cited. It is highly cited. People refer to it to justify their own research, to inform their own research. The reason why it is useful to read those foundational articles, to spend time with them, is because they offer an advantage, a very important advantage, and that is that they articulate and discuss the basic assumptions of the field of research in a way that is more explicit and more direct. So if you read only recent articles, they take for granted that style of reasoning, that style of caring that we talked about before. But the relatively more foundational articles in any field, they discuss why it is that we should adopt this style of research, this style of reasoning, this style of asking questions, and these methods. And that explicit discussion of the foundations of the field is very helpful in grasping, again, the basic ideas in the field. We can use this analogy of a tree. If you think about a field of research as a tree, the trunk of the tree, the main body of the tree are those foundational articles. And the leaves and the tiny branches are the recent articles published in the journals, maybe the last 5 years, 2 years. So when we go to the foundational papers, we are getting in touch with the main tree trunk, the part of the field that is attached to a longer history, the longer life of the field. Here we can also ask, of course, about the roots. What are the roots of the tree in our analogy? Are they also the foundational papers, even more foundational? We can also think about them as the philosophical assumptions, the metaphysical, ontological assumptions that are taken for granted in a field of research. And they are just like the roots of a tree are invisible. Those philosophical assumptions in any field of research, in psychology or social science, they are relatively less visible. The third idea, how do you remember what you read? With a little bit of experience, you realize that we tend to overestimate our memory and we forget really quickly. We also overestimate, I think, the degree to which we understand an article. So a good habit to form, and it is in writing, in an attempt to write a summary of an article, it is then that we become aware of whether or not we understand, how much of the article we understand, how much of it we remember. This is a snapshot of half a page of a document that I used to work on during my PhD when I was working on the references of my PhD thesis. So under every reference, I had a very short summary, main points that I took from that source. Fourth, I encourage you to either join a journal club or organize a journal club, initiate one if there's no such club around you at the moment. With a journal club, you read and discuss articles. Yeah, maybe you meet once a week or once every 2 weeks. I can devote a whole video to this topic. Again, if you like, give me feedback on that. The fifth idea is that it's normal to find bad writing styles. You might realize that in your field of research, there's a lot of poor writing that is difficult to understand, writing that is unnecessarily technical, full of jargons, again, not necessary. In my field, psychology, Michael Billig and this really great book, Learn to Write Badly, How to Succeed in the Social Sciences. This was recommended to me by my friend Peter Limberg when I was a PhD student in Toronto. I'm very grateful for having read this book because I became aware of the excessive use of nouns in psychology as opposed to verbs. So a style of writing really builds an image of reality. And if you use too many nouns and refer to things and reified process, thingified concepts, as opposed to processes and action, that kind of distorts the way we relate to our subject matter. And it is also good to become aware of when a piece of writing is unnecessarily technical. So that was the fifth idea. 6, identify different contributions to your field represented in different styles of articles that are published in the field. So we can have empirical papers, review papers, theoretical contributions, historical contributions, and critical contributions. Then we can, once we realize the distinction between these different ways of contributing to a field, we can then ask, is our field biased in favor of one of these forms of contribution and against other forms of contribution? For example, my field, psychology, unlike a field like physics, which has a strong theoretical branch and a strong experimental branch, our field, psychology, is unfortunately, it has a disadvantage because it really underestimates the necessity of theoretical and conceptual work. So many people in psychology, even professors, they don't really understand the role of theoretical work and the contribution of theoretical articles in a field of research. It is really useful to become aware of these distinctions early on, the difference between an empirical contribution and an historical contribution or a theoretical contribution, because these are distinct ways of contributing to a field, to bringing balance to a field, to helping a field become aware of different aspects of itself. An excessive bias toward empirical work will bring hyperproductivity, but that will be at the expense of understanding, losing understanding and theoretical clarity. The 7th idea that I've divided into 2 parts, I would encourage you to identify your inspirations. And the first part of your inspiration, I mean, one way to discuss your inspirations is with regard to the people who have inspired you or who are inspiring you, giving you motivation. So for my PhD work, I was inspired by the works of Bernard Hammel, Michael Posner, and Jan Tehus, and other people. But these 3 really stayed with me. And I continued reading their works, reading their articles. These are some of the foundational articles in my field were written by Michael Posner, Bernard Hammel, Jan Tehus. So it's good to identify them because that enables you to organize your thoughts and your progress in terms of a relationship with people who have inspired and informed your research project. You can ask with respect to these people who inspire you, what is it that they are concerned with? What is the core concern of, let's say, Bernard Hammel? What are the ideas that he regards as the bad ideas? What is it that he's arguing against? These are really helpful questions to think about. So, another thing that is helpful to be aware of, to identify in terms of inspiration and being informed, being in touch, being up to date, is the main journals. During my PhD, the main journals that I kept up to date with were Psychological Research, Attention, Perception, and Psychophysics, Psychological Science, and Journal of Experimental Psychology, Human Perception and Performance. The other JEP journals were also important, but Human Perception and Performance was especially important. Nowadays, these are not really central journals for me. Nowadays, I am more likely to check out Theory and Psychology, Human Arenas, Integrative Psychological and Behavioral Science. So as you change your style of research, your projects, your main journals will also change. Idea number 8, compare your understanding with your advisor's understanding. That's really helpful. I remember discussing papers during my undergraduate with one of my mentors, and she told me, oh, the way I read this article is different from the way you are reading this article, because we had different concerns at that time. And we realized that we are focusing on different aspects, even though we were talking about one single article, but we were focusing on different aspects of that article. And when we discuss our understanding with somebody else, our understanding is enriched. You realize that there are other ways of reading the same text. And it is also important to note that your memory is going to be more fresh. You're probably going to be more aware of some technical detail of the stuff you read compared to your advisor, who probably doesn't remember some of the detail or some of the articles that you're reading. But your advisor has hopefully a more abstract understanding, more conceptual understanding of the field as a whole, and has a more organized representation in their mind of the field and its long-term prospects. The main thing is that your mentor should be interested in your reading and regard your reading as an indispensable part of your training. If you have a mentor who doesn't care about what you read and maybe even discourages you from reading because you won't be productive enough if you read, that would be a red flag, in my opinion. So maybe I can say more about that later on, but that's good for now. Idea 9, most likely you will never feel like you have read enough. So instead, you should give yourself a break every once in a while. You should say, okay, for now I've read enough. Now I will focus on writing a chapter in my thesis. Now I've read enough. Now I will rest. Don't wait for a moment in time where you say, when you are able to tell yourself that I have read everything that I have, that I had to read. Because the more you read, the more you become aware of things to read, and you become aware that reading material from neighboring fields, for example, if you're in cognitive science or cognitive psychology, you become aware that it would be very helpful to know a little bit about other fields like sociology of knowledge. That would really enrich your understanding of cognitive psychology. It would really enrich your understanding if you know more about history of psychology, if you know more about the history of cybernetics, for example, or if you know about philosophy of science, philosophy of social science. So it's never really that point of telling yourself that I've read enough, I know everything now. That's not going to happen. So instead, it's good to tell yourself, okay, I decide that for now I've read enough. I will continue later. I'll take a break to accomplish another side of my project. So last, the 10th idea. Occasionally and regularly, I still do this, reflect on why I'm reading what I'm reading. Is it just work? Is it an instrumental reading? Is it an enjoyment in it? Is it connected to my long-term plans? Am I learning new things? Am I being challenged? Is it difficult enough? Is it interesting enough? And these kinds of reflections might help us revise what we are reading or change a little bit what we are reading. We can also ask ourselves, what is the difference for me between reading articles and reading books? What are the benefits of each one of them? And why is it that in a PhD program, we are encouraged almost exclusively to read recent articles, not books and older articles? Are these biases in our reading? Is the fact that our reading habits are biased, does that reflect a bias in our thinking and in our vision of our field and our discipline? Let me end with some recommendations. These are some really good books you can read. Sam Ruscha's A Primer for Philosophy and Education, Sven Brinkman's Qualitative Inquiry in Everyday Life. Sven Brinkman's book is important, not just because it is a good exposition of qualitative inquiry with everyday life material, but because of its presentation of the essential features of research, what it takes to do a piece of research, and how research is not really that different from living a life, what we already do as living human beings. I would also invite you to check out my Patreon. I have a series of videos ongoing series of videos about Sven Brinkman's book, Qualitative Inquiry in Everyday Life. And, in addition to other Patreon exclusive videos, another ongoing series on the Jung reader. And if you join my Patreon, you're also invited to join our little reading group, which is really a great place. I'm very thankful to have this reading group to read together and discuss ideas. I also offer mentorship if you're interested in, kind of consultation. I've had so far even university professors who sought some, consultation from me, mentorship, temporary, of course. That's it. If you have any feedback, any questions, any suggestions, feel free to leave them as comments below. Otherwise, thank you for your attention, and until next time.